He's Howard Ibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of two books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Henry, we're back with another episode. Today, we have Christopher Owens, the head of brand strategy at TRG, formerly the Richards Group. This is going to be an amazing conversation. Part one and part two will come up next week. Let's join the conversation. We're back with another episode of the Brief Brothers, and I'm flying solo today because Henry has succeeded in dodging Hurricane Milton, thankfully, and he's doing well. So, and actually, it's kind of nice because this is the second time that I've had a conversation with someone from TRG, formerly the Richards Group. The first time was with someone that you hired, Christopher, Sarah Walker Hall.
Yes.
And I interviewed her solo as well. Henry was, I don't know what he was doing then. So TRG in Dallas just gets me. You're fortunate. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but our guest today is Christopher Owens. He's the head of strategy at TRG. He's been at TRG for a very long time. So he's had a powerful impact on strategy at this legacy agency that's done some fantastic work. We're going to talk about that. Christopher, we've been exchanging emails, and finally we get to meet. Thank you for being on the Brief Brothers.
It's a pleasure to be here, Howard. And like you said, it seems like this has been a long time in the coming. And yeah, excited to talk about whatever. It seems like there's so many things that we could talk about. And I know the first time I reached out was when I started to realize somehow in my Google searching or whatever it might be, this brief that kept popping up out there in the wild, this Kiwi brief, which I'm very familiar with, and
Yes.
whether it's the format or the content, etc. I remember, working with Sarah to enter that, into the planning awards back then, and I kept, I wonder if he would ever want to talk to, the person behind it, and so that's I think how we first met. I reached out in some form. I don't remember when it was or how it was. But to say, if you ever wanted to meet, the mind behind this, we can make that happen. And so, and again, thank you for that. It was a wonderful series of episodes, multi
Yeah.
situation that went on. But yeah, excited to be here and head of brand strategy at TRG, which is a part of a strategy collective. We actually have our CSO, the great Chris Farrell, and I sit alongside some other heads of strategy that pull together about now 70 different strategists across brand strategy, connection strategy, data strategy, media strategy, and brand performance marketing. So that all kind of
Wow.
comes together into a collective group. But then I'm one of those heads.
So you said 70, 70? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, yes, exactly. And so when you pull all of the different strategy groups together, that's what we represent in that regard.
That's larger than some ad agency's creative department. That's extraordinary.
That this is correct. Now, if you then isolate just the brand strategy group, we're about 9 or 10, right? So what would have
Okay.
been classic, and when I first started at the agency, when it was referred to as the Richards Group, we referred to it. It was account planning,
Mm-hmm.
then brand planning, and then brand strategy over the course of the almost 25 years that I've been there. So I experienced those different shifts in nomenclature in real time as they started to shift and ebb and flow, in our own industry. But yeah, that's where we are now.
You've started to answer the first question that we like to ask our guests, which is what drew you into the industry when you got started? And then if you could give us a little bit of a brief, to coin a word, a brief summary of your career trajectory. You spent most of your years at TRG.
Yeah, I'm one of those rare, monogamous, ad folk that do exist out there. I've met others, and we
Mhm.
commiserate on that subject. But that is the case. My origin story, if you will, I found over many years to be terribly unoriginal as I get to meet students and other strategists, and we have the same question in that it goes along something like this, kind of a creative misfit. If you go through the course of my life very quickly, first thing I thought I wanted to be was a cartoonist. Then I wanted to be an architect. Then I wanted to be a drummer. And so music has played an important part of my life. But then, in essence, like language, pop culture, film, art, just kind of a social science, liberal arts kind of misfit in a way. And I was always looking for an industry that didn't feel like work, right? That didn't feel like a job. And yeah, so I originally went to university as a jazz studies major. And in some ways, it's still all jazz in many ways. But was just not irresponsible enough to continue the life as a professional musician playing in bands, but was around enough creative class people that when I started to put two and two together and start to realize, okay, I need to be more responsible, get out of the back of a white van, get some insurance, essentially start to live an adult life, sell out and work in advertising. No, I mean, a lot of my musician friends were art directors, copywriters, designers. One of the bands I was playing in, I had just kind of become like the makeshift shoot from the hip kind of marketing person as a part of that. And so helping as a part of a group of people inside of that band just kind of get the word out. And that was always something that fascinated me. And so yeah, I got a foot in the door position at a small to medium-sized agency in Dallas called Gleason Calise. It's about 70 people. This was during the dot-com days in the late 1900s. And I started as an assistant AE, just as a foot in the door, position, and was doing that a couple of months and just starting to get to know what everything was. And there was an ECD, a guy by the name of Don Sedai, who took me aside. And I remember, and this is where memory gets very romantic, and whether this actually happened or not, there's something like this happened. I think you'd make a good planner. I think you'd make a good account planner. And didn't necessarily know what that was. There really wasn't one in the agency at that time. And I remember asking why, and it's like, well, the creative teams like hanging out with you, and seem to be a smart guy, and people pay attention to you. And he's kind of broke down just this almost sort of like superficial rudiments but really, I was just being the Christopher I'd always been, hanging out with the kind of people I'd always hung out with, and enjoying, the kinds of conversations I always had just naturally fallen into. So then I remember I called the 4As to mail away for a pamphlet. And at that time, the 4A, to kind of learn what it was, because this was pre what we have now, that just,
Right.
there's no shortage of information about, how to be, what we say as a strategist nowadays. And they sent what I then later come to realize was the JWT planning book. I mean, essentially, it was a rebranded version of Stephen King's sort of seminal, text from, I believe, March
Wow.
1974, that they had put some Fourier's logos and things on, and whatever. And that little pamphlet, I remember reading that pamphlet, and it's just plain spoken, just laying out the really the belief system behind this discipline, and in some ways along the way also hinting at the kind of person that might be curious enough to want to head down this career path. And I remember thinking, okay, now it's making sense. Now it's making sense. And so yeah, the discipline kind of that found me through a creative director, executive creative director, but really just a creative misfit from the beginning. And again, that's what I always hear, this circuitous, asymmetrical, nonlinear path that everybody comes in. I love to tell students it's just a great way to commercialize a liberal arts degree, or if you're in the social sciences. Yeah.
We hear that. It's surprising, or maybe not surprising, but Henry and I hear that a lot. And that's our story. I mean, I didn't get my first copywriting job until I was days, maybe a week away from turning 30.
Right.
And Henry was wanted to be a high school history teacher. He's going to go into economics, and had a business that he had that failed, and went to work for an agency just as something to do until he could figure out what his next step was. And the rest is history, as they say. So it is a circuitous route. more and more today, I think, and it'd be interesting to know if you agree with this, because you are an educator as well as a practitioner, because there are a growing number of programs in the country at official universities as well as ad hoc. I don't know if you call Miami Ad School ad hoc anymore.
Portfolio school, yeah.
A portfolio school, and like the Arts Center in Pasadena and others around the country. More and more young people in their 20s, I mean, really, their young 20s to mid 20s, are identifying creative, account management, planning, media right away and going right into the industry. And it's not as indirect as it was for you or for me. Are you fine? What's your take on that?
No, I certainly find that. I mean, you are just nowadays just one click or gesture or swipe away from whatever you want to be next. You know, if you just dream big enough, you can find some hyphenated version of an occupation that's out there that just seems to kind of complete you. And for those who I think, have those tendencies of, a bit of a creative problem solver, sometimes you feel like you're in limbo, between, well, I'm not really a writer, I'm not really an art director, I'm not really a this, I'm not really a that, but like something about the concept of a brand, which I find people very, my daughters, as an example, very early in life, they're now adults, but like that concept of what that is is also something that I think people are just far more fluent in understanding much earlier, in life, to where those things just start to come together much more quickly. That you start to see that there's a there out there, for you. And so, in some ways, maybe it's less spontaneous discovery, although I still continue to hear that from some folks. But I also am meeting and have met many people who come in very deliberately saying, this is exactly what I want to do. And they have some sense of the history too, right? They've hit the Wikipedia page. They can say Pollitt, they can say King. They know who those two people are, and they know it's not the Stephen King that always tries to put a scary clown in something, which I always thought that if it was that Stephen King, would this be not just such an interesting discipline, right? That's all we would be trying to do in everything, is just find a way to put a spooky clown in everything. But no, it's the King with the J in the middle. Like they come in fluent, not all of them, but they come in with that fluency, just based on having access, effortless, reflexive access to the information.
My experience has been that people in our industry are wildly ignorant of our own history. So would you say that your experience in meeting these young people who know who, Stephen Pollitt was and Stephen King, Stanley Pollitt and Stephen King, or John Steele,
Right.
are they the exceptions?
I would say that the pipeline that I have visibility to is probably already a bit exceptional in that regard, right? Because, when you're evaluating a strategic planning boot camp or thinking of portfolio school, let's face it, you're down the mythical funnel to a certain extent. I'd say that's been different in other education experiences, whereas teaching more at university or ad research or something like that, that's a bit more broad in its description. Um, but I would step back and say, however, though, I think as an industry, if you talk to someone interested in fashion or architecture, like they know Frank Lloyd Wright or Coco Chanel, and like they know that. I think nowadays, if you just think about early career people interested in advertising, if you want to talk about Gossage or John Webster or Sir Haggerty, or if you want to start to, drop some of those names, you might get some blank stares.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't think you
Try
would
John.
find equivalent in other creative class industries, where I think the educational institution has indoctrinated us, for better or worse, to understand the shoulders that our industry is built on. And so, yeah, I'd say relatively speaking, yeah, in the ad world at large, our memory is rather short in that regard. But then that's job security in some ways for learners or educators like myself in that regard, because that's a part of the story that I love to tell, because I feel like there's a torch that's been passed there that I feel some responsibility to move forward with.
Well, I agree. And I've told a story a number of times. Maybe you've heard it on a previous episode, where I was in doing a training for a Silicon Valley tech company whose name I won't repeat. This was pre-pandemic. I went to San Francisco, and I happened to have been a freelancer at Ogilvy, LA, on this particular piece of business 20 years, or not quite 20 years earlier. And it was a major piece of business, and the creative that came from Ogilvy was remarkable, won some awards, moved the needle. So when I went up to San Francisco I was working for the Association of National Advertisers, the ANA. I went up to this headquarters to do my workshop. I was rather proud to say, hey, 30, 35 people who showed up in the room, I used to work on your account as a copywriter on this particular piece of business.
Right.
And they looked at me like I just landed from Mars. They'd never heard of the campaign, never heard of it. No one in the room had been in the company for more than 5 years.
Right.
Which might sound like an excuse, but if you're curious or interested in your own brand, wouldn't you do a little digging? I guess not. Now, that's one anecdote. I'm not going to take a broad brush and say, everyone is like this. But when you have leaders like Paul Feldwick writing a book, not the Peddler Sings, the other one. Well, yeah, it's 2 books. The first one was The Anatomy of Humbug, where he really goes into the history. Who is John E. Kennedy? We all know who John F. Kennedy was, but do you know who John E. Kennedy was? That'll stump people at a cocktail party. Now, if we don't know who these people are, how do we build on what came before? Henry has often said, it wouldn't be a bad idea if brands would have on staff a full-time brand historian whose sole job was to create an archive of what's been done, marketing efforts, advertising campaigns, community efforts. We're basically agreeing with each other, but my take is it's a huge chasm. I'm gratified that you're seeing that others are more informed, but I think that's the exception. And you're right. When you really are going down into that deep, that funnel gets narrowed, and you're deciding you're going to choose this particular area to study, and then that's your career. You have to know. You have to make it part of your educational experience. But I think that's rare.
Yeah, it is. It is. And, if I had to get, I would say, as part of in between sessions, there's always an evaluation period, or really, to be honest, now it's all year. People kicking tires, interested in the boot camp, or just interested in strategy at TRG, whatever it might be. I would say if I had to be generous, it would be like a third are coming in knowing enough to be dangerous, and then the other 2/3 I would say are just fairly green on some of these subjects, but their passion and interest for the specific tasks and skills that they want to do is there. It's just they just don't know that it all started somewhere else, and that it's being built off a legacy. But I mean, everything we're talking about here has been made possible through the advent of Web 1.0, 2.0, and your ability to socially connect with other people. And then really the algorithms are starting to figure out you want to be a strategist now more than you probably know. So that Don Sedi ECD experience I had at Gleason Calise, essentially the algorithms are now doing that. It's like there's a million Don Sedis out there that are starting to point you towards, a Sweathead Community, or Julian Cole, or Biba Madison, or one of the portfolio schools, or any of those people who are out there, very, very openly talking about, pulling in early career strategists or people who are strategically curious, and then guiding them along these paths. So yeah, I mean, I would say it's a good thing. It's progress, but there's always an opportunity to learn more. And I think once you think you've figured it out, that's where I get the most worried, right? And so like, if I go back to my origin story, there's an important leap there, which kind of pull these two things together. Is I then worked at Gleason Calise for about 3 years, just kind of shooting from the hip. Like, literally, my first boss was a VHS tape with the name Earl Cox on the side of it, or a VHS tape from an APG event that the agency bought for me, that said Jane Newman on it, and another one that said Douglas Atkin. So my
Mm,
first bosses were VHS tapes with, typed out labels on them. And that's how I think about it, and then obviously, the John Steele book, right? And so
right.
the idea of then taking this to the next step and saying, now I don't just want to be the planning department. I want to be among other, I want this collegial vibe scene. I want to be learning and pushing and prodding and understanding. And I could have amazing conversations with the creatives and some of the account people. This agency very supportive of me in this endeavor. And this was a period of time. I think it sounds like it's about the same time I entered the industry that Henry did, enlisting some of the previous mid 90s. And so 97 in particular, then 98. And it was late in 1998 that I started to get really kind of like, okay, like, am I going to have a boss? Am I going to have colleagues? Literally, like, am I the one person in the 70-person agency that is championing, planning? At which point, a direct mail piece came my way, wonderfully hand illustrated with all these wonderful, beautiful photos and illustration and hand done typography from a woman named Pippa Zekrist, who hand built this direct mail piece about this thing called the Bootcamp for Account Planning. And that it happened once in 1998 at this place called the Miami Ad School. So this was my discovery moment for this thing called the Miami Ad School. And that there was a semester-long session that essentially brought all of the key planning leaders, in some cases from around the world at that time, to this one location in South Beach, right off of Alton Road, this old VA home, that for an entire semester, you could move there. And then you could learn almost like 7 days a week for an entire semester from a sort of a revolving door traveling set of first and second wave, planners coming through talking about, like, here's the state of the art, like this is the fundamentals, and here's how you should be thinking it now, and really representing the history. And what I realized as I was going through this direct mail piece is all of those names on those VHS tapes, now I could actually go meet them. I could train with them. Jane Newman, Douglas Atkin, Chris Chalk, Pam Scott, John Gerzema. These are people I could now go hang out with. And all it took was getting accepted to this, once in a lifetime program that only took 20 students from around the world. And you had this obstacle course you had to run to do all these short stories and these fun, different creative exercises and things that you had to prove yourself, and an interview and all this kind of stuff that you had to do. But if you could pass that gate, yeah, you could go be a part of that. And I remember, like, I took this direct mail piece to, my boss at this agency essentially was the head of creative, Don, and Charlie Calise was the founder of the agency. Anyway, the timing was great because I had just won Employee of the Year at like their annual thing. And so I coupled these two things together, right? So strategy, right? This is all strategy.
Right.
And said, if I got accepted to this, like, would you sponsor me? Would you sponsor me to do this? Because they'd already given me a million reasons why they couldn't hire me a boss, and why that would be expensive because you have to bring them all over from the UK, and you have to have an immigration attorney, and no, all this kind of thing.
And planning was still pretty new back in those days.
Yeah. This was the same decade that, that Jay Chiat quote of the best thing that ever happened in new business was account planning. Like, that was still echoing around the industry. And agencies of different shapes and sizes were trying to find ways to kind of get in on that. And so there was still a huge supply demand issue. And the whole reason why the Miami Ad School ever started this thing called the Account Planning Bootcamp was to address that concern. And it was all of the planners that were being brought over to the US. I've listed their names off now multiple times,
including John Steele out at Goodby, doing all
right?
the work he did for Got Milk,
Right.
drawing attention to that.
It was absolutely, it was like that was becoming a common denominator to the kind of work that at that time was sort of creating the sort of vanguard of the type of creativity that was really going to make the work. And everyone was trying to figure out, how are they doing that? How are they trying to make it that way? How are they creating and designing work in that sense? And so the original boot camp in 1998, was put together by those original planners that came over, and now heads of department in the US that had no one to hire. Like that's like they didn't have anybody that they could easily, and there wasn't enough talent in the US to trade, and
Mm.
again, it's expensive to continually bring them over through, immigration, et cetera. So they partnered with the Miami Ed School with Pippa in particular, and said, you know what, let's build some kind of a training program that starts to vet and or excite or add some velocity to the extent to kind of roll our own planners here, in the US. And that was a program that in 1998 happened, and then they made a bunch of noise about it. And then somebody like me, it hit me at the perfect time. It's like, okay, well, you can't afford a boss, but what about this? And I remember, like, if you get accepted, we'll talk about it. And so I'm like, well, hell, I'm gonna, you know, I've got motivation, right? And so passion, let's do this. And so yeah, I got accepted, and I came back and called their bluff, and and so okay, now, right? Like, now let's talk about it. And so yeah, they sponsored me. I went down. I was one of 20. It was pretty grueling. I mean, like two students dropped out over the course of that, because it was like 7 days a week. I mean, we had one day off, but really that's the day that you work with your creative teams to actually do work. And I think that's one of the things that still distinguishes the program, in that it's not just strategists learning with strategists from afar watching videos and things like this. It's like, no, it's an agency simulation. You are then working together, with creatives in a physical space. The boot camp is now a virtual experience, but the involvement with creative teams and working with creative teams, that's still one of the things that makes it so, um, distinctive in that regard. But anyway, like I somehow finished top of my class and
Wow.
left realizing this. Okay, so it started off a hunch, right? Somebody saying, I think you'd make it. And I'm like, what? And then cut, within a year and a half, less than 2 years, later, I'm doing this program, and I'm meeting Jane Newman, and I'm meeting these people that were once just my VHS tapes, and now they're live, and I'm asking them questions, and they're teaching me, and I'm literally like sensing them in the room, and keep asking the questions, and all this. And although it was like, in some cases, like 72 hours spent with some of these individuals, the extent to which I felt like that's my mentor, that's my pace car, that's my unlock moment, where I start to see this, like, new version, of myself. That happened. Yeah. So
That is an amazing story, Christopher. And, I have to smile when you mention the fact that you received a direct mail piece, which I spent a good chunk of my creative career doing direct marketing and direct response. So bless her heart for putting together a piece that got your attention. Don't ever let anyone try to convince you that direct mail doesn't work. Clearly it does.
exactly.
So let me dive down a little bit. What excites you the most about what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis?
Learning.
Mm.
It is impossible for me now to separate the concept of being a strategist and being a teacher. They are the same. Let's talk about them in a way that makes that clear, right? So,
I get it, but I want to hear how you explain it.
right, it's like all of a sudden there's something that you need to know that you don't know much about, right? And and so you go off and you do your learning, right? And then you might even be doing this ideally with other people who are also put in the situation to learn this together, right? But then at a certain point, you feel like you've come to what feels like enough of a conclusion to where, what? I think we figured this enough out to now do something with it. So now I've got a larger group of people. Now I'm going to guide them, and I'm going to help sort of teach them as to these things that I've learned about this that I previously didn't know. And then they get involved and they go, well, but this thing and this thing, and then now we're learning together, and now we're making something out there, in the world that's bigger than ourselves individually. And then you do that enough, and then you start to know where your own gaps are, right? Because now you have put in a situation now to teach something else, and you start to realize, you know what? There's gaps in here. And then you start to like learn into those gaps and fill out those gaps and then teach those things. And so this, if any nerds, watching or listening to this, that's the sort of Richard Feynman, teaching principle, famous physicist, sort of a kind of a hero, that, the best way to learn is to teach,
Yeah,
because you immediately become sensitized to what you don't know.
exactly.
And then you fill in those
Exactly.
gaps, and then the first thing you do is then when you learn that enough to where you can try and teach it to someone else, right? And then you understand those gaps, it puts you in a situation where innocent questions are coming back at you, and your blind spots become, more less blind.
Right.
And then you just keep moving. And so this concept like brand in motion stays in motion. I feel like we as practitioners in this industry, that is how we need to be operating. So it's a simple question you asked, but it to me, it's that's an energy there. Learning it, I get most worried about, oh, I've got this all figured out, right? Like that version of me petrifies me, because I know that that's when I'm like screwed, right? And so I'm very conscious about that. I try to no longer say, well, this is what I believe. To me, it's this is my current understanding. My current understanding of this is that. And I want to stay out of the faith business. I don't want this, I want to stay out of the, well, I believe, no, because then you're off. Next thing you know, it's witchcraft and you're the victim of your last conversation, and it's rhetoric and the loudest voice in the room or whatever. And it's, a big breeze comes through and there's no roots, and whatever that thing you think is just blown out the window. No, no, no. My current understanding is this. And I'm willing to shift that and to unlearn, to learn based on the best evidence.
That's
And we're,
almost the basic scientific method. The
yeah, and we
scientific
are.
method, we state a hypothesis. Let's test the hypothesis. I'm not going to come to the hypothesis with a bias. I think it might be X, but let's find out if it's X. And if it's Y, okay, let's find out why it's Y.
Mhm. Or you come to it very knowingly with all sorts of biases that are completely outside your control, because it's some kind of fitness advantage that allowed us to, our species to propagate. But you're aware of them and not in denial of them and can keep them in check, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm one of those people, I don't have a bias against bias, right? Bias just is. But I'm very cognizant of mine. And then when I step in, to situations where there is something new to learn, that's one of those things. It's just sort of it's almost like a mindfulness practice in that regard. But this really all just gets back to, again, that simple question that you pose is what excites me. And it's just learning. And we are in a golden age at this point of understanding how advertising works and just marketing, in general. And there's no shortage now of an evidence-based understanding to how that works, which then does then kind of sort of nicely start to clean up various eras of me when I first started in the business, where I know things I was operating back then that I felt to be true because other people around me were just exhibiting that behavior, but I never actually went through the rigor of understanding I didn't question it, yeah, whether it was right or not. And so yeah, we're in that period. So to be a learner in this industry right now, is, yeah, your cup runneth over. There's so much to learn every single day.
Two observations. One, I would say the one thing I've learned over the years is that the older I get, the less certain I am of things, which is in agreement with what you're saying. I purposefully question things with more ease and comfort than I used to, because I don't know everything. And when you're 15, you know everything, right? Or
Right.
you think you know everything.
You feel like you do.
You feel like you know everything. And that has actually made it easier for me to become an instructor and teacher of recorded briefs, because I'm not a strategist. I like to say I'm not a strategist. I play one on Zoom. Okay. And Henry has reminded me that I am a strategic-minded creative because I'm the guy who sits there and says, yeah, well, why? Explain that to me more. And because of that, that bone has been removed from my brain, I'm a lot more comfortable, in fact, more eager to reach out and listen to strategists who are smarter than I am and learn from them and apply their philosophy, their teaching, their beliefs, all of the above to my teaching to make my teaching stronger and better and more diverse. So that's been fun. Our first episode, when Henry and I recorded it in January of 2021, we asked the question of ourselves, well, what do we need? What makes a really good creative brief writer? Since the whole point of the podcast was creative briefs, that was how we started. And Henry went first and he took my answer. So I had to scramble and figure out, what am I going to say? He said, you need to be a good writer. A brief is not a form to fill out like a driver's license form where everything you already know. You're not really thinking, you're just simply regurgitating. This is a thinking document. So I thought about that for a minute. I said, well, you know what else you need to be? You need to be a good listener. And not just with your ears. You need to be able to pay attention to what's going on around you. Right. So something I said popped up something on my screen here. So I'm just serious listening, and it popped up the music.
Right.
So over the course of the many episodes, we've talked with a lot of strategists, and I have learned so much about this field just listening to Henry and listening to good, smart people like you and Robin Hafetz and John Steele, and then art directors and copywriters like, George Tannenbaum and Dave Dye. Which leads me to my next question. And you kind of hinted at this, but I want to press it a little. It says, what beliefs, even though I know you say you don't like to use the term beliefs, but let me just ask it anyway, what beliefs define your approach to work?
Well, so let me start with one that in some ways kind of bridges something you said here earlier as well, in the sense that you referred to yourself as not a strategist, right? And then Henry corrects you that you're a strategic writer. In that regard, I think I would side with Henry in this regard. Is to me, in some ways, I think the worst thing that account planning ever did, right? So like the original sin from the late 60s, early 70s from BMP and JWT was making popular this concept that there can be either a practitioner or a process or a department that helps guide your strategy. And in doing that, it gives, by saying this is a planner and they're responsible for strategy, it gives an alibi to all the other disciplines, functions to not be strategic or to not see themselves as strategists. And that to me is the original sin of the discipline. Now, it was a commercial practicality and convenience to suggest that understanding the real humans that we are trying to connect with, that the real markets that we are trying to move that are made up of just group human behavior, right? Like that's so important, having that understanding that we need a champion. We need someone who just doesn't do the job at the very end of a very long day when they've set up all the lunches and all the calendars and all the budgets and all the things, that just kind of copies and pastes some brief like document at the very end of the day, right? Like that's not how good strategy is going to get done. So practically speaking, the reason why planning then rose to what it is was because of that need. But simultaneously, it took the pressure off and in some ways disallowed an identity for someone to say, I am a strategist. Some of the best strategists I've worked with have been creative directors in my career. So to me, strategy, it's a competency, it's a discipline, it's a practice that absolutely everyone in our industry can get better at, and should be able to look in the mirror and see a version of them, in that regard, and proudly refer to them, themselves, as that, as being strategic in that regard. And
isn't that the argument that used to be made? I'm not necessarily against account planning, but to say, well, we've always had account planning, and it used to be in the creative department.
we've always had strategy, and it just used to be in some of our most open-minded, intellectually curious lateral thinkers that could have been an account person, or or whomever it might be. Or, I love the episode with Robin Heifetz, who is also someone I've followed career, throughout, from Mad Dogs and Englishmen. I remember that brief being one of the ones that was actually introduced to us when I was, in the boot camp, back then. And um, that you could be an assistant coordinator, a coordinator, like you just someone that then starts to present themselves and step up and be seen as a creative problem solver, right? Or someone that has fresh angles on helping accomplish what brands need to grow. And all of a sudden you start to realize that, this can be unlocked in pretty much everybody. And so back to this kind of like a first principle that I have is that strategy is so important. It needs to be championed and represented in the process. And thus I am all for there being, a strategy department and all of the kinds of things. But it's something that I expect and encourage among every team member at the agency, and yes, my clients as well. And some of the best strategists I've spent time with have also been, God forbid, clients. To me, it is something that it is a way of working. It's a way of life in many ways. Um, that we as it's part of being a successful human, you
Right.
know, of just navigating the world, around you and every day.
One of the things you said earlier, which prompted a comment that I made, and I said I had two things. The first one was this, I took this bone out of my head that said, I forget what I said, but the second point I wanted to make was, are we trying there? I would say there is a cohort in our industry that believes that we need to be more scientific in what we do, because there is a fear. And I think Steve Harrison has addressed this. Nick Asbury has addressed this in his new book,
Mm.
The Road to Hell.
Road to hell, literally, about purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this idea that we must prove that we're more than just entertainers, that we
Mm.
need to have this scientific principle to demonstrate that we are a serious business. And that if we're not taken seriously as scientists or social scientists or practitioners of some measurable aspect of what we do, we're only going to be, we'll be relegated to entertainers, which personally I think is really what we're best at. But there seems to be a cohort, as I said, of people in this industry who are afraid of that, who don't want to be reduced to something as simple as being an entertainer. When that's the best work that we've done captivates the attention in a way that great entertainment does. I mean, Bob Hoffman likes to say the best brief is, I disagree, but he says the best brief is make us famous.
Yeah.
And to become famous, you have to do something wow-like, unforgettable. But there's this I think there's this conflict. Some people simply don't want to be perceived as anything less than, there's a seriousness to what we do. And this is demonstrated through strategy. This is demonstrated through our measurement. This is demonstrated through the use of AI. We have all these tools now at our disposal to measure whether the advertising campaign is effective, which I applaud. I mean, I've been a direct response guy for years. I want to know, is this idea, is this list, is this offer moving the needle? My job is to sell. But I just think there's enough people out there who simply don't like that idea. Do you agree?
Oh, I mean, people can like and not like things, all day long, and we are living on a sort of subjective stage that we're all, performing in and around. I mean, these are things that we know, but this debate between is what we're doing commerce or art, commerce versus art, to me is
I wouldn't
it's
use the word art. I
well, to
wouldn't
me,
use the word art.
I feel like it's the best commerce that convinces you that it's art, right? So because this is commercial art, the commercial part is really important because it's about reproducibility. It's about, I like the work you did for them. Can you do it for me? and then being able to say, yes, we can, right? And being able to accomplish that. And so there are maps for these territories. Like there are things that we now know that if we choose to go the opposite direction, we just need to do so, with peril. And a lot of these fundamentals and these principles of doing the right things right when it comes to effectiveness are, it's just like having good plumbing, right? It's like it's just realizing that there needs to be certain conditions set in place to allow for the quote unquote genius creativity, to be seen. But when we know of all the different levers that we can push and pull in the market on behalf of our client, creative quality is still the first lever that we have access to that provides that greatest profitable ROI of, I think, 18x now, if you look at the work of Paul Dyson, in that regard. And so creativity and the ability of garnering the attention through emotion to build those strong memories that are then retrievable when people are ready to go by. I mean, these are simple understandings that we now have as patterns to recognize. And that to me is when I talk about, trying to be more efficacious in the kind of work that we're recommending. It's those kinds of principles in that regard. So to that end, not knowing that or uh, avoiding those subjects essentially then are the reasons why, our industry still puts out an 84% failure rate on most advertising because it's never memorable enough to matter.
Yes, sir. John Hegarty says only 6% of our work is effective. And he said, if we were in the brake industry, we'd be
Yes,
out of business. And I
right.
would say, well, if you were a surgeon and you only had a 6% survival rate, you'd be arrested, sent to jail.
Exactly. And so it's understanding this so that we can say then, and the 8416 it's a Ehrenberg Bass Institute, metric, and Sir Hegarty has worked with System One and Orlando Wood to kind of play that out too with regards to, what surpasses neutrality and starts to activate System One all the way up in their star rating, and right, like they're so, in that regard, like we're able to quantify this. This is now becoming a financial conversation where we can have,
Mhm.
it's, you don't have the budget to be boring, says a Greg Hahn at Mischief, or, the extraordinary cost of dull, the concept between Peter Field and Adam Morgan that really didn't start to put a finer point, on this. But it gets us back to reminding us that there is a commercial outcome that we are looking to accomplish, and that is how our industry, works. And that's what we're being expected to do more often than not. But again, the numbers don't really look very well in our favor when it comes to our ability to do that on any given day. But there are now maps to help us understand, to make it harder for us to fail. But it is not a color by numbers,
No,
hit,
and
hit the win button kind of formulaic kind of thing. And I think that's how some people misunderstand it, to be going. They feel is that, and that's where you get that repellent allergic reaction. Um,
I think that's
from
common among. I think that's very common among creators. We reacted with repulsion at the idea of research is going to tell us how to do this. With testing, it's going to tell us how to do this. I'm a lot calmer and more sanguine about that because I was grounded in direct marketing and direct response, and I understand the value of that measurement and testing. And as you said, System One and other service providers out there are giving us powerful tools, not just to measure the effectiveness, but are we tapping into the right emotions? And that's key. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
He's Howard Ibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye bye.
Bye.